Alright guys, I'm here back with a new video, and in this video we're wrapping up my coverage of Survivor 42 by finally getting around to doing the player ranking for the season. So in this video I'll be ranking every player from the season of Survivor 42 based on how I feel like they played across the season. So with that, let's jump right into it. At number 18, the bottom place person on the list for me is a player who didn't seem to have much potential in this game, and that person is Mariah. And Mariah and the next person we'll be talking about are very close considering they go home in very similar circumstances. But Mariah is slightly different to me considering I just don't feel like Mariah had much wiggle room moving forward had she survived. I mean, we do know that she had a very close ally in Jackson, where Jackson gets medevaced, and through that leaves her with pretty much nobody, which is obviously unlucky, but it does sound like Mariah was going to be the first boot anyway, even if they went to tribal before the Jackson medevac, and really, I just don't know how much potential there really was there. I mean, she just seemed to be a pretty passive player, was looked at as the weakest of her tribe, and through that was just kind of an easy boot. Again, I just don't know where she was really going beyond this. So for me, I have Mariah at the bottom here at number 18. And now at number 17, we have someone that, again, very similar to Mariah, but went out one round before her, and that person is Zach. Now again, both Mariah and Zach were technically voted out at the first opportunity in unanimous votes using their shot in the darks. I mean, they're both very similar games. I think for me, the difference between Mariah and Zach, though, is that Zach seemed to have allies. He had someone in a Tori who wanted to work with him initially. He had Romeo who wanted to save him in this round and ends up failing to do so. But again, at least Zach had allies that wanted to keep him around, unlike Mariah, who really didn't have anybody outside of, I guess, Jackson, who got medevac. But I do feel like Zach had more options moving forward. I think if Zach had survived this tribal, I would have a lot more confidence in Zach to have a decent run than Mariah, who really didn't seem to click with the modern game of Survivor, where I do think Zach is someone that, given enough leeway, would have been able to potentially have a solid run moving forward. So again, it's very close between Zach and Mariah, but I think Zach has some minor pros that leave him above her at number 17. Now number 16, we're moving on to a person that we just have so many unknowns with, and that person is Jackson. And Jackson, again, obviously gets medevaced before the first tribal, so there isn't really much to gauge from his game. I mean, we do know that he was close to Mariah, and it did seem like they were kind of a duo that were like under the assumption that Marianne was going to be the first boot, though it seems like that wasn't actually the case and it was going to be Mariah. But that means Jackson's probably safe during that first round. It does seem like Mariah would have been taken out over Jackson, and if Jackson had survived that, Taku doesn't lose a challenge moving forward. So that more than likely means Jackson makes the merge if his medevac doesn't happen, which in that case, who knows where Jackson goes? Like, based on what we've seen, I do have some reservations on Jackson's overall game ability. I do think there's probably like a lack of a killer instinct, but it is like this unknown element that for me puts him above Mariah and Zach, who both go home at the first opportunity. Jackson doesn't seem to be the person that would have been booted, and also could have had longevity, but also, again, like, we just don't know a lot about his game to where it's tough to put him much higher here than number 16. Now number 15 and really next two are kind of similar players as well, in that they were at one point well positioned on their tribes, but then their games just completely blow up. At 15 here, we have someone that I think does it a lot more actively, and that person is Daniel. And again, Daniel really just completely sinks his own game, where he was so well positioned early on, where it seemed like him and Chanel were the swings. They were deciding between Mike and Jenny and Hai and Lydia, and part of his downfall does come from the fact that Chanel does give up her vote, but mind you, Daniel was approving of that plan. And also, what really blows up Daniel's game is not the sole fact that Chanel gives up her vote, it's how they react to that. First, in the fact that they continue to side with Mike and Jenny in a situation where they know there's serious risk at that point in going that way, but also obviously him blowing up his own game once we get to the deliberation section, where first off, he instantly folds to Hai, giving Hai all the leverage in the negotiation, but then also throws Chanel under the bus. And through him having now voted against Hai and Lydia, throwing Chanel, who was his closest ally, under the bus, and also making it look like he was so willing to let Jenny go, which pisses off Mike. He essentially pisses off the entire tribe to where he's such an easy boot the very next round. In a round where, like, I don't even think he should have been the boot. Like, I think while on paper, yes, he does betray all of his allies, I do think Chanel was someone that was a lot more dangerous in the game. And the fact that they do still vote out Daniel over Chanel, despite the fact that they were also very anti-Chanel, I think is also an indicator of how bad Daniel played during those rounds. Again, like for me, it really was a complete mess from that third round on, but it is this aspect of him being well positioned for the first couple rounds that do leave him off of the very bottom here at number 15. Now at 14, again, a very similarly positioned player, a player that was also well positioned early on, but then has their game flipped on them not too long afterwards, and that player is Swathi. And Swathi is an interesting figure here, where I think Swathi is a player that probably does have potential if she were to return, but based on this season, again, she is in the majority early on. She does vote out Zach, but even then, she's not a focal member in that majority. It is Rox, Drea, and Romeo that seem like the core, while she's like kind of on the outskirts, though has relationships with Tori, Drea, and Rox. But it's her trying to play both sides that does lead to her eventual downfall, where she does obviously try to blindside Draya, but Rox isn't willing to do so, and eventually Tori rats her out, and it's like her boot round really plays out as poorly as it could have, but it's really not nearly as disastrous as someone like a Daniel. Like, she does obviously play sloppily here, but it's not some of the worst gameplay I've ever seen. And even in her eventual boot, Rox is still voting with her. Rox wanted her to stay, and really in a world where Rox was a bit more of a mendable player, Swathi probably would have been able to pull off this Draya blindside, and from then, who really knows where her game goes. Like, I do feel like there was potential with Swathi, but considering how early of a boot she ends up being, it's tough to really put her much higher here than number 14. Now, number 13, we're moving on to the quote-unquote merge boot. I mean, it's the person I'm going to consider to merge boot, and that person is Lydia. And for me, I think there is a serious argument of Lydia being lower. I mean, Lydia is someone that should have been booted at the Jenny boot. Like, she 100% should have been the boot there had it not been for things completely out of Lydia's control and the fact that Mike and Chanel had both lost their votes. Lydia straight up just goes home that round. So she gets very lucky in that. And because of that, I could have argued that she would have been even below Daniel. But again, like, I don't feel like her gameplay is like actively bad. It's more so just extremely passive. And then also she does technically course correct immediately afterwards. Mind you, how much of that was truly active on her end, I don't know, but we do see her and Hai obviously pick up Mike. But even then, it seems like it's Hai that is really taking the reins of that pair, where Hai and Mike are the two that get closer there. And obviously Lydia gets cut by the time the merge, which, by the way, we get to the merge where it does lead to another pro of Lydia and the fact that she was in the initial majority, she was in that super alliance, and largely gets screwed over due to the hourglass twist, which really limited the available options. And through that, and Tori also winning immunity, she does end up going home there. So again, it's like her actual boot round was actually a lot of unlucky circumstances, but she also got extremely lucky to even be there to begin with, as she really should have been like the third boot of the season. So again, it's kind of a conflicting game to where I feel like the pros and negatives kind of cancel each other out, and considering her placement here, and I decided to just land her around where she ends up placing at number 13 here. Next up at number 12, we have the last remaining pre-merger on the list, and here we do have Jenny. And again, for me, like, I could not rationalize putting Jenny lower than Lydia. Like, I feel like Jenny, again, gets completely screwed over in her boot round, in a position where Lydia 100% should have been the boot. Like, for all intents and purposes, Jenny did outplay Lydia in this round, to where, like, I just could not argue her being below Lydia, unless obviously it was a situation where, like, Lydia got extremely deep into the game. But I mean, Jenny really played as optimally as she could have. Like, I don't think Jenny makes any major mistakes on this season. I mean, she recognizes the power of her vote, and through that doesn't take the risk at the ship wheel the first round. She has this really strong bond with Mike and are able to pull in Chanel and Daniel, but then gets extremely unlucky in the fact that both Chanel and Mike have lost their votes. The Mike one in particular being extremely unlucky, considering Mike didn't even know that was a possibility of him losing his vote when he got the Beware advantage. And really, I think the eventual Jenny boot really comes down to just tribe strength. I think that's the main reason they end up voting for Jenny over Mike, is because of perceived tribe strength. Now, technically, you can argue that, okay, she was a bit too passive in how she handled Hai and Lydia, where she should have been more active in trying to get them to not vote for her to begin with. But really, I feel like that's the only semblance of a true flaw I can see in Jenny's game here. Like, I think Jenny played as well as she could have, considering the circumstances she was put in, but just gets extremely screwed over through the various amounts of advantages that were going around. And I actually really think Jenny might be one of the best players to be booted in the pre-merge at this point. And I think there was a serious debate for putting Jenny even higher on this list. But it is the fact that she was like so far removed from the remaining people on this list that made it tough to really put her too much higher. But I do think Jenny played as well as she could have, and because that she lands here number 12. Now number 11, we're at the bottom of the players that made the merge. And at number 11, I do have Tori. Now, I will say that I think Tori's game for me probably gets better over time. I feel like at the time of her boot, I did look at pretty poorly, but then like once Express came out, and it turns out that like she was pretty well liked by the cast. And the fact that I think if she had survived her boot round, I think she could have been in it for the long haul, considering how the entire game broke out from that point forward. But I still struggle to put her much higher on this list, considering the fact that she was really just on the outs the entire pre-merge. I mean, while she does vote out Zach and does vote out Swathi, it's like those are her allies. Like, she's literally left with the core 3 from that group afterwards and is really just in survival mode the entire pre-merge. And then once she gets to the merge, she also is in survival mode, where if she doesn't win those first 2 immunities, she's more than likely going home, and gets booted the very next round in a position where I think at that point it's kind of wonky whether or not she would have went home there, where obviously we know that this Draya blindside had been set up, but it's like unknown of like whether or not Drea was going to play her idol either way. And then if they do, it's like I do feel like Tori would have been more likely to go home than Marianne under like natural circumstances there. Even though I think there's like an element of bad luck to how everything played out there, I think she was a very likely boot anyway. So again, like, it's a game that I do think is pretty bad on paper, but I do think Tori probably does have more potential than I gave her credit for in the preseason. Where again, having seen her on Sequester, I was never really that impressed with Tori, despite the fact that she also made a deep run on Sequester and definitely had a lot of win equity on that. But to be honest, I felt like she came out as a more competent player on Survivor 42 than the Tori I saw on Sequester, even though she was kind of on the bottom for pretty much the entirety of it. But it's the fact that she was on the bottom and was taken out at the first time she wasn't immune after the merge that does have to have me land her here at number 11. Now, number 10, we're moving on to the player that I think there's a debate that this person's worse than Tori. However, I feel like there's some minor pros that put him above her, and that person is Roxroy. Again, Roxroy for me is not a good player. I think he's one of the worst players on this cast if we're looking at it from a more general outlook. But in terms of the games that they played on this season, like, again, he was at least in the majority for more of the game. Again, Tori was someone that was on the bottom the entire time, had to win immunities at points. Rox at least was part of that core on Ika, and it didn't seem like he was ever actually going home on Ika. And then once we get to the merge, Drea pulls him into the Super Alliance, despite the fact that he's on Exile. And while he does get his own alliance flipping on him at the split tribal, for me it's like those elements of him being in the majority for a lot more of the game is enough to put him above Tori. Now again, like, as a whole, I don't think Roxroy's the greatest player. I don't think he seems to get the strategic elements of the game. I don't think he is good socially in the sense that he comes off as domineering and also doesn't really seem to care about his social relationships. It's like, I don't think Roxroy's a good player, but in terms of the games they play on the season, he was at least in the majority for more of it, and because he is here at number 10. Now, number 9, we're moving on to a player that I do have some hesitancies on this player, as this is someone that has a similar trajectory to that of Daniel, who was so far back on the list at this point, but did make it farther, and I do feel like this person had a sliver of more potential, and that person is Chanel. Now, Chanel being at 9 here is not really because I think she actually played that good of a game, but it's more so because I feel like there is like a massive gap in between the people at the top of the list and the people towards the bottom here, where Chanel isn't that far apart from any of the people we just talked about. But I do feel like as a whole, this cast is very top heavy, where there are a few pretty good players, but then almost everyone else is either kind of just mediocre to outright bad. And again, Chanel for me, I think the potential is there. I think Chanel does get the strategic elements of the game when we're just simply talking about the numbers and trying to keep yourself safe and that sort of thing. But I don't think she fully gets the social ramifications of her moves. That being said, Chanel was well positioned alongside Daniel early on in the game. She seemed to be the one that was actually making decisions for the duo, and later ends up out-surviving Daniel. That being said, though, again, there are obviously massive negatives here. Obviously, the fact that she does risk her vote, which puts her in a position where we get to the Jenny vote, where she loses Jenny and also reveals to High and Lydia that she betrayed them in a position where they're now in power. Again, that's not great. And really, I mean, that is essentially the entire downfall of Chanel. Like, from that point forward, like, she's kind of on the bottom. Again, she has the fight for survival against Daniel, but even beyond that, the rest of Swathi doesn't trust her moving forward, to the point where they throw her under the bus immediately after a merge and do plan on targeting her at the merge. And she's only saved by the fact that the hourglass gets used and then is immediately booted the very next round. Again, not really much potential to do much in these rounds, considering she's already on the bottom. Like, I really feel like it is that one move of the events of the Jenny round that really just sink her game. And again, like, while her voting for Mike at the Daniel boot didn't help, I don't feel like that was truly like the game-ending move for Chanel. I think Chanel really put herself in a bottom position after that Jenny round and really just struggled to find her way up. Mind you, part of that's also on Daniel. Again, like, I do feel like the fact that Daniel blew up their relationship to where it was pretty much irreparable after that, I think that's obviously something that you have to factor in here, as if that didn't happen, then Chanel would definitely have a lot more leverage moving forward, where they could fight to try to get Mike back on side. But really, I feel like Chanel is a player that does have potential, doesn't necessarily realize it on this season, but the reason she is above Rocksroy and Tori is because, again, she was at least like actually well positioned early on in the game. Where, like, even Rocksroy, even though he was in the majority for more of the game than Chanel was, he was never a decision maker within that majority, while Chanel was the main decision maker up until the Jenny boot, where everything just crumbles after that. But again, at least she was able to get into that position to begin with. For me, that's good enough to land her above him at number 9 here. Now number 8, and here we have the final 8. But the first one we're going to be talking about is one of the finalists, and that person is Romeo. And I do not look highly on Romeo's game. I think Romeo actually plays a pretty bad game, to where I think he probably plays one of the worst runner-up games in the history of the show, where he really is just completely aloof during the entire post-merge section of the game. And while his pre-merge isn't bad necessarily, like, he is obviously aligned with Drea, and they seem to be the core of Ika and do make the decision of voting out Swathi, it's like he's also not getting his way when Zach goes home. So, like, even that's not even perfect. But again, once he gets to emerge, he's just completely left on the outs. He's not put into the initial majority alliance, and from that point on, he's really just scrambling from the bottom, put into survival mode, not really knowing what's going on. Where he votes incorrectly so many times along the way, he's not really pulled into any plans until the Omer boot, and even then, he was already drawing dead by that point, and also the move was the least beneficial to him out of the people that made it, considering, unbeknownst to him, the vote was being split onto him. Again, he really has no win equity on this season. I don't think there's any scenario he wins, especially Final 3 scenario. Even the Final 2 against Jonathan, I think it's like not even really there. Like, I don't know how Romeo wins this game. I really don't feel like Romeo was doing much for the entire post-merge of the game, which is why it's kind of funny that he's as high as number 8 here. And a lot of that's because, one, longevity, obviously. He doesn't make it all the way to the end. But also, it's like, I still think even beyond that, he probably still plays better than Chanel, who he obviously outplays in the round that she goes home, where Chanel goes home over Romeo. And even before that, I do feel like Romeo was better positioned coming into the merge than Chanel. Romeo was better positioned than Rocksroy and Tori in the pre-merge. Obviously, everyone else was voted out in the pre-merge. So it's like, technically, Romeo is like inherently better than any of the people we already talked about, despite the fact that I have like massive holes with Romeo's game. And again, this is what I'm talking about, where I think there's a massive discrepancy in this season between the like good players and really just everyone else. And the fact that Romeo is this high, despite being completely aloof for half of the game, and then not even being in like full control of the original Ika, is a pretty big indicator to me of how wonky this list is. But again, for me, Romeo does land here at number 8. Now, number 7, we're moving on to 2 players here back to back that are kind of similar in the fact that they were big threats in the end game, but both get taken out back to back. But I do feel like, for me personally, there's a big gap between the next two, even though they have a lot of similarities. But at number 7, I do have Hai. And I talked about this in my review. I don't think Hai played a good game. Like, I don't think Hai is that great of a player. While he is propped up as this big jury threat, I do think he's someone that, one, completely mismanages his threat level to where everyone knew that by the time of the final 8, which makes him a very clear target. But also, even before that, he is someone that gets extremely lucky in the Jenny boot, where he pretty much does nothing intentional to get that to go through. Where again, he does flip his vote, but not because he actually thought that flipping his vote would matter to the actual result, but more so because of his own ego of wanting this like perfect voting record. And through that stumbles his way into causing a 2v2 tie to where it eventually leads to the Jenny boot, which through that lets him take control of Swathi moving forward. But again, that was completely luck-based, where he had no clue what was going on there, had no clue that Chanel or Mike had lost their votes, had no clue that flipping his vote would even matter. And when people credit him for negotiation, it's like, yeah, he didn't mess it up. But Daniel literally just hands him the negotiation. Like, Daniel literally starts negotiation by saying, I'm not going to rocks. So again, I don't feel like there's much to really credit Hai for that round. I think a lot of it is just him getting extremely lucky in how poorly the other players played, and then also him doing things by accident. But then he does do good work immediately afterwards, where he does flip Mike over. He does add Mike to his alliance with Lydia. Again, that is pretty good work. Obviously, they remain in control for the Daniel boot, where they do split the vote. So again, I think the strategic forethought is there if he has all the right information. The problem is that he really didn't early on in the game and should have been in a worse position than he ends up being coming into the merge. But then once we get into the merge, again, he is part of the group that does create this super alliance. Like, he is one of the main orchestrators of it. So credit to him for that. But immediately afterwards, he lets go of his closest ally in Lydia. And while I think at the end of the day, like, him letting go of Lydia wasn't really the death knell for his game, in the sense that I think he was always going to be a big target moving forward and would have struggled to actually make it to the end. Obviously, getting rid of your closest ally that early in the game, someone that is undyingly loyal to you, is a really bad move in that position. And the fact that he is so willing to get rid of Chanel the very next round, someone that he also at least has a connection to from the original Swathi, that's pretty bad. And also to see him like try to flip the vote on Romeo and fail is also pretty bad. He then flips the vote to get rid of Roxroy, but again, that's not really in his best interest either, considering he's keeping around Romeo, someone that's actively coming after him. And then we get to his boot round, where he just gets completely outplayed by Omer, can't even keep Mike in line, despite him genuinely wanting to take Mike far into the game. Like, really, for me, there's not much to truly praise with Hai's game. It's like, I do think he took advantage of all the other players' mistakes that stemmed from that Jenny boot. So I guess that's good. And then I think the merge round, at least the beginning of it, where he forms the Super Alliance, that's good. But then like almost everything else is bad. Again, the entire Jenny round is him stumbling his way through and accidentally getting the right result for himself. He lets go of Lydia and Chanel back to back, the Lydia one being even more egregious. He keeps around Romeo, this person that is directly targeting him, and then he gets blindsided by his own alliance in a near unanimous vote. I mean, there's not really much to praise for me, but he was one of the biggest jury threats on the board, and had he found a way to get to the end, he would have won the game. And considering the semblance of strategic credit I can give him, and really the fact that I don't think this is the greatest field of players in terms of how they play the game, I mean, this is enough for me to land high here at number 7. Now, number 6, again, next person on the list, to me, played a game that was a better version of Hai's, and that person is Drea, where I think their games are pretty similar. And once we get to the merge, again, Drea is part of that Super Alliance, works alongside Hai throughout the early post-merge, and then immediately after Hai's blindsided, Draya is immediately taken out as the next biggest threat. In terms of their post-merge games, it's a very similar game, but Draya slightly outlasts Hai, though to be fair, Draya also kind of needed her idol at the split tribal, but also it's a split tribal, to where I don't think that round happens in the way that it did had the tribes not swapped out that way, to where I think Draya probably is safe under most scenarios there. So even that's like kind of a bit of an unlucky circumstance. But again, like post-merge games, kind of similar to Hai, but instead doesn't really have the issue of taking out her own allies to a degree. I mean, like obviously Tori was someone that was on her on the original Ika, but they had a hostile relationship at that point, so I don't really fault her too much for taking out Tori, as I don't feel like there really was any connective tissue between them. So I think it's a slightly better version of Hai's game in the post-merge, and I think pre-merge is just outright better. Again, like Hai is someone that took control of his tribe eventually, but largely due to him looking his way into that position. Draya is someone that instantly takes control of the original Ika, is in numerous alliances, in alliance with all the girls, in alliance with Romeo and Rox in a position where she's able to take out Zach, the only person she's not aligned with. And then follow that up with her and Romeo being able to suss out Swathi and immediately take her out there. Again, she pretty much has full control of the original Ika tribe and obviously has all these advantages along the way, which is something. But obviously, like, we get to her boot round where she misplays it, but also it's like she's already on her way out during that round. Anyway, I think no matter what, Draya was pretty primed to go home without the use of advantages. And she does end up misplaying her advantages. Obviously, she does tell Omer about the knowledge is power. That's a bad move. And really, I think just overall her amount of trust in Omer, and to be fair, that can go to high as well. I think that was a massive knock against her game. But in comparison to High, it's not that dissimilar of a situation where I think she has a better pre-merge than High. She outlasts High in the post-merge by 1 round, and to me demonstrated a lot more impressive game ability across the season. So while I do think she has similar faults to High in terms of her threat management, I do feel like as a whole she's just a better version of High's game, and because of that she lands here at number 6. Now, number 5, and now we're getting into the tougher decisions with this list, where essentially we're down to the Taku 4 plus Mike. And I do think for me, these are definitive top 5 of the season, but I feel like the order is very wonky. But at 5, I am going to go with Jonathan. And Jonathan's an interesting case here where I feel like he's a player that has a bit of a roller coaster of a game. I mean, I think he starts off really well, where initially he does bond with both Lindsay and Omer, and they create the initial majority on Taku. They also have Marianne working alongside them, and then also he has a good relationship with Jackson, to where, again, it's kind of a similar case to Drea, where they take out Mariah, the only person that Jonathan doesn't really have that close of a relationship with. And then moving forward, they don't go to tribal ever again. Now, along the way, his relationships with Marianne and Lindsay start to deteriorate. But I don't think there's ever a point where Jonathan is actually going to go home in the pre-merge. I do think he is pretty solidly positioned there, and is the reason why they never go to tribal, considering he almost single-handedly wins a number of challenges in a way that I feel like you rarely see in Survivor. To see someone dominate that much in team challenges. But obviously it does make him a massive threat come into the merge, but I think he does pretty well to subvert that threat level, where despite being the secondary target many times across the merge, he's able to get through round after round anyway. And again, part of this is due to the fact that by the end game, he definitely was looked at as a GOAT. I don't think anyone actually thought Jonathan was going to win by the end, and that definitely plays a factor into that. But I do think early on, like, the merge round is a round where he 100% should be going home. Yet the fact that he built such a strong relationship with Omer to where Omer goes out of his way to save Jonathan there, I think is pretty good work. And I think Jonathan himself does pretty good work as well in bonding with the likes of High and Mike, to where they also feel incentivized to keep him around. We obviously have his massive downfall in the game, starting from the Tori boot, where I think he completely blows up his relationship with Lindsay at that point, which had been simmering for a while, but I think at that point Lindsay is completely out on Jonathan through the way that he acts. But then also, obviously, his display at that tribal, I think, is also a bad look from a jury perspective. Though, to be fair, he does kind of come close to pulling off a Draya blindside, where if that had gone through, I think Jonathan is the person you would credit for that move, considering he is the main person that is pulling all the people together for it. Once again, he is the secondary target during the High boot, and then potentially could have gone home during the Draya boot had he not won immunity. And to be fair, even if he didn't, he would have been in do or die, but I don't really fault him too much for that, considering I do feel like Draya would have gone home anyway in that position. But I feel like an element of Jonathan's game that gets missed out on their show is the fact that I think he deserves a lot of credit for the Omer boot, where Jonathan is the one to pick up on the fact that Omer's playing pretty much everybody by finding out that Omer and Lindsay are working closer now than he is to Omer, which partially you do fault Jonathan for kind of slacking on his relationship with Omer. But also the fact that he was able to recognize that and use the information of the Idol Nullifier to flip Mike against Omer and then get Mike to pull in Marianne, I do think is good work on Jonathan, and it's probably his best move of the season. It's starting this chain that eventually leads to the eventual Omer boot, to where even though I don't think they managed the perception of that round the best, where Mike and Jonathan kind of back out of the move slightly, that allows Marianne to take like full credit for the move, I still feel like Jonathan deserves some credit for that. And then he once again survives the vote at 5, though again at that point it was more clear that Lindsay was a threat, and then goes out in fire in a position where I don't know who actually gets voted out at Final 4. had it been a straight up vote, I think it would have been interesting to see what would have happened there. But I'm assuming Jonathan makes it through. To where not been for forced fire making, I think he probably is a losing finalist, so at least there's that. But again, I think it's overall a bit of a mixed game. I think there are points where he does make impressive game moves. I think he does good work in setting up initial bonds with people on the original Taku and then immediately after merge. He does do good work in managing his threat level, and then obviously we have the Omer move. So again, I feel like there are points to point out of good moves from Jonathan, but he also had 0 win equity, to where I don't think the jury was going to reward him with the win in most scenarios, and because that's tough to put him much higher here than number 5. Now number 4, moving on to a bit of a debate that I had between 3 and 4. I think 3 and 4 are very, very close. I can definitely see the argument for the person at 4 here being at number 3, and I do feel like the edit definitely probably factors into this assessment. The fact that we saw more of what the third place person did than this person, and because at number 4 I do have Lindsay. And again, I think there is an argument she should be higher. Lindsay is someone that from the outlook does seem to be one of the bigger jury threats on the board. It does seem like she would have won if she had gotten to the end from the 5 on, and comes pretty close to even surviving that final 5 round, where Marianne had been in her corner for a lot of that round and even thought about using the idol to save her. So I think that is something to factor in there. So again, that is a big pro. The problem I have between her and the next person we'll be talking about is, again, just the fact that we don't know as much of what she was doing early on. On the original Taku, she is decently positioned throughout a lot of it. I don't think she was ever in true danger of going home unless they went to tribal probably twice. And then at that point, even then, I think Omer would have had to make the decision. Don't really know where he would go at that point in the game. But Lindsay was relatively safe coming to the merge. At the merge, she's part of the Super Alliance. Again, she doesn't seem to be a super active participant in the creation of it, but she's still a part of it, and kind of just rides that wave until the split tribal, where at that point we kind of see more of what Lindsay is doing, where we see more of her relationships with the likes of Drea, and obviously we see her relationship with Omer eventually, and we see her as this very competent player, but we also start to get her being very tunnel visioned on taking out Jonathan. I feel like that becomes a lot of her edit from that point forward, to where it does seem like from a game position, she was just so focused on trying to get rid of Jonathan to really her detriment from that point forward. Where during the high vote, she wants to get rid of Jonathan, but doesn't because she's convinced the other way around. And the fact that she has the amulet at the final 7, she, once again, is so tunnel vision on getting rid of Jonathan that she participates in do or die, to where she has a major chance of going home that round, largely because of how tunnel vision she is on getting rid of Jonathan. And then I feel like she does play the final 6 round pretty poorly, where her and Omer make it pretty obvious that there are a pair. And the fact that she has this amulet idol that she doesn't end up using at the last time that it's available to be used because of her being scared of building the perception that they're already a pair is showing how far behind she is on the information in the game, because they're already being looked at as a pair. But again, she is a player that was technically in the majority for a lot of the game. She gets towards the end game in a position where she probably wins if she had been able to get there. She comes very close to winning that final 5 immunity, where if that had happened, she more than likely does win the game. And even without that, comes very close to surviving the final 5 round anyway. So again, I think it's a mixed bag of a game. I do disagree with certain strategic decisions she makes across the season. I do think she gets too tunnel vision on Jonathan, but she comes very close to winning the game and is in the majority for a lot of the game, and that is the reason why she's here at number 4. Now number 3, again, for me, there was at one point debate for this person being number 1. I actually thought coming into the finale, this person would be number 1, but then I dropped them down a bit, and at number 3, we do have Omer. And again, Omer versus Lindsay, I think, is kind of close. I think it's definitely up for debate. I think Omer is a player that obviously we saw a lot more of. We saw a lot more of his active work in getting his way. But I feel like Lindsay was obviously closer to winning in the fact that she made it one more round and also comes very close to even surviving that round. And also I feel like Omer makes some mistakes in the final 6 round, though to be fair, Lindsay also makes mistakes. So again, I do lean towards Omer being higher. I mean, initially on the original Taku tribe, it did seem like he was potentially the best position in the game. I mean, again, the core 3 did seem to be Jonathan, Omer, Lindsay, with Omer being the center of that grouping by the end of the pre-merge. And while he also had a really good relationship with Marianne as well, he seemed to be pretty well positioned coming into the merge. And at the merge, we see him being part of the Super Alliance, but then instantly is able to flip the vote onto Lydia and save his original Taku 4 members. And again, he does very good work at that round. He once again is someone that's kind of behind the scenes, trying to lead high into voting out Roxroy, and does good work there. He is a major orchestrator of the high boot, where he does actively lie to Mike in a position where Mike then decides to fully flip on high, which causes that vote to go into motion. And at the final 7, it's like he has such a good bond with Drea to where Drea tells him about the knowledge of power, to where he is able to get the idol from Mike in order to take out Drea. All really good work. Now again, there are some downsides. One, the fact that technically, from what I understand, the knowledge is power was only countered because by that point, Omer had already been found out and Jonathan had already told Mike about the idol nullifier, to where Mike felt more secure in that he was going to give the idol back because he knew that wanted to use the idol nullifier against him, not because of their genuine bond. But also, I feel like Omer doesn't make the greatest endgame decisions there. Like, I do think him getting rid of High is probably the right decision. The fact that while High was someone that did want to go to the end with Omer, he's also someone that is a big threat in a position where you already have other big threats on the board, namely Draya. But I do think him getting rid of Draya, though, is a bit of a misstep. I do think keeping Draya in the game could have shielded him a bit longer, particularly his duo with Lindsay. I also feel like his failing to get Lindsay to play the idol on him, despite him wanting to get her to play the idol on him, I think is also a failing on his end. And also, I'm not 100% sold on his jury chances. I think that's something that I do question, and is also another reason why I debated on having Lindsay higher, is because I do feel like Lindsay would for sure win a jury vote, where I'm not 100% sure about Omer, where Omer wanted to go to the end with Lindsay, but I'm not 100% sure if he does win. Where I could definitely see the jury being bitter at Omer. Supposedly he had a really poor reception at Ponderosa, and who knows if the likes of High and Drea, these two players who, while I do think they wanted to reward gameplay, are also two players who were planning on going to the end of Omer, and he does backstab them to where, like, I don't know if they would respect his move to backstab them at that point. So I do feel like there's some hesitancy on that end as well, but I do think Omer was probably the most consistently strong player across the season. To where really, I think up until the Draya boot round, I don't think he has a true flaw in his game. But I do think he also becomes tunnel visioned in the game, kind of similar to Lindsay, but in a different way. And where, like, I do think his entire plot to use the idol nullifier and trying to organize the game in a way to where he would be able to use it successfully is something that does become a bit of a pitfall for him as well. But I think he played most of the game really well, but does have big enough holes at the very end to leave him here at number 3. Now number 2, and obviously we're at the final 2. Like, we're at the top 2 here, and I do struggle with where to go here, where one technically outplays the other by the end of it, but I personally would have voted the other way. But when I assess who I would vote for, I'm not really factoring in the perception from the other jurors. And I think when factoring that in, I do think at number 2, I do have to go with Mike. Obviously the runner-up of the season. And again, I would probably vote for Mike over Marianne. However, I think Mike has enough glaring holes in his game to where I think he does need to be number 2 here. I think Mike is someone that was in more control than Marianne. He is someone that is in the majority for more of the game than Marianne. But I think he causes his own downfall in the game. Again, he is on the initial majority on Vati, where he does align with Daniel and Chanel, gets them to go on his side, and the entire Jenny situation happens, which is a massive mess. But even beyond that, he's able to reorganize and get with High and Lydia, getting into the merge in the position where he's added to the Super Alliance. Again, all really strong work up until that point. Like, he is playing a very solid game, where despite the fact that he's not being this like true shot caller in the game at that point, he is still very well positioned and someone that is in the majority for the entire game up until that point. But then we get to some rockiness, where first up he gets rid of Lydia, which I get him wanting to keep Jonathan around over Lydia. But I do think the target of Lydia is one that definitely doesn't benefit him. Obviously, someone from his original Vati tribe, someone that he had a closer relationship to than a lot of other people. So I think that's a bit of a misstep. And you follow that up with getting rid of Chanel, who, obviously, by the time he gets rid of her, has a pretty hostile relationship with her. But a lot of that's due to his own actions. Like, he did not need to be as openly frustrated at her for her putting the vote on him, especially because he does the same thing back. So I feel like that's one, poor jury management and showing his hypocrisy to Chanel. But it also is getting rid of someone that, again, could have been a potential ally had he not blown up his relationship with her to begin with. We then get to Split Tribal, where he doesn't get his way. He wants Roxroy to stay, Roxroy goes home, and then we follow that up with him being tricked by Omer into getting rid of High. So, I mean, this is a weird portion of the game where, like, he does technically have control during the High and Chanel boots, but he's largely doing these vote-offs due to emotional reasons. Like, these vote-offs don't really benefit his overall game, especially the High one, where High was willing to take Mike very deep into the game, but he's doing these moves because from his point of view, they betrayed him first. And the same thing happens again at the Omer boot, where while I think he deserves some credit for getting Omer out, it's also once again he's being told by Jonathan about the idle nullifier, which causes him to fully turn on Omer at that point. Again, with the assumption that Omer turned on me, so now I need to turn on him. It's not a proactive move of him actively trying to get rid of the big threats in the game. It's coming off more so as he's making these emotional moves because he feels betrayed. And following that, we have some wonkiness at the final few rounds where, again, poor jury management, him promising everyone that he's going to use the idol on them, only for them to all know that he's lying to them. That's not great. And while he is looked at as a person that convinces Marianne to vote out Lindsay, which is in his best interest, I do feel like at that point he's still harming his overall jury potential. And we get to the final 4 round where he does beat Jonathan, but Jonathan was someone that he was going to beat at the end. I think he fails to get Marianne into fire, where even he admits after the fact that had he won immunity, he would have given up immunity to go up against Marianne in fire, as he looked at her as the only remaining threat in the game. The fact that he ends up failing to take out Marianne at the final 4 there is also a failing of his. But even despite all this, he comes in the final tribal with a chance to win. Now, it's not a guaranteed thing. I do think it would have been very close. I think had Final Tribal not happened, he probably would have had the votes of like Lindsay and Roxroy. But he has such a bad Final Tribal performance that it caused him to lose those votes. Again, the fact that he continues to talk about playing the game with honor and loyalty in a position where it's so easy to call you out for it, to which they end up doing, is just not a good look. Where I really feel like Mike's downfall in the game is largely on his own accord. I feel like a lot of the reason why he doesn't win the game is due to his own actions and due to the persona that he exudes. I mean, he is a player that has more control in the game than the next person will be talking about, but also does more actively bad in the game to me than the next person. So because of that, for me, I do have Mike here at number 2. Now number 1. And we obviously have the winner of the game here in Marianne. And again, I think this is a very strange case that Marianne is number 1 on this list for multiple reasons. I think one, the fact that, again, I would have voted for Mike over Marianne. But I do feel like Marianne had less holes in her game. Again, I think she is a player that, while she's not controlling the game throughout a lot of it, she's never truly in danger, well, at least throughout their post-merge. Pre-merge, again, she is probably going home if they ever lose a tribal. That's not great, but even then, she's still better positioned than Mariah, and Mariah goes home first. But it's like, when she gets to emerge, she's never targeted from that point forward, despite her never being part of the core majority group. So it's like, while she has very little control over how the game is playing out, she's still not doing much actively wrong. And she obviously pulls off the Omer blindside, which is probably the best individual move of the season. And while I do think Jonathan and Mike deserve credit for the conception of the plan, it is obviously Marianne that executes the plan and does it near flawlessly, and does it in a way that can take away credit from Mike and Jonathan in terms of the jury's eyes. Even though I don't even think that fully comes to be, but again, it is very impressive how she maneuvers through that round. And the fact that she's able to articulate why that move was best for her at Final Tribal, where she goes through all the different scenarios of what happens with the other players winning Final Immunity, I think that is impressive on her end as well. Again, Final 5 rounds very wonky for me, where it did seem like she wanted to keep Lindsay around for a lot of it and really changed her mind at the last second. The fact she even considered keeping Lindsay around to begin with, and actually even gives Lindsay the advantage in the immunity challenge, is a pretty big knock. I mean, that is essentially her increasing the chances that she loses the game by increasing the chances that the biggest threat in the game gets to the end. Again, that's not great. Though obviously when she has the opportunity to take out Lindsay, she does eventually do it. But then we get to the final 4 round, which I do think is a bit wonky in the sense that while she does do good work in having Romeo take her to the end, I don't know if she, and like obviously we're in the point of Survivor where everyone is playing knowing that forced fire making is coming. I also don't think her read on the final 4 round was the most accurate, where from the way she talks, she thinks that Mike would have taken her to the end. She also thinks Jonathan would have taken her to the end. I don't think those are accurate reads. I don't think that's actually what would have happened. Now, I do believe that she believes this, but I don't think that's actually what would have happened. And from the way that Mike talks now, which obviously is skewed by knowing that he loses to Marianne, he does talk about if he were to win final immunity, he would have given up immunity to take on Marianne in fire, to which he probably wins based on how well he did in the true fire making challenge. Also, if we were just doing a more standard vote at the final four, I think Marianne is also going to fire in that situation. Where I do think, again, Mike and Jonathan, I think we're sticking together at that point to go for Marianne. Marianne and Romeo probably go for Mike. And in that case, Marianne loses fire also. So it's like, I don't know how well positioned she truly was at final four. Though obviously she believes that she was, and does get lucked out by the fact that Romeo does win final immunity. But even despite being this like very likable presence and this person who did pull off this Omer move, she does come into final tribal not even guaranteed the win. Where the vote between her and Mike, again, is pretty wonky. Where I do think she probably edges it out, even without her final tribal performance, but it's extremely close. And like obviously she does have an incredible final tribal performance, one of the best in recent years. And through that, fully secures the win, but also Mike has a really terrible performance as well, to where that obviously factors into things. But I mean, really, again, like Marianne is number one here, largely because I do feel like she has less holes in her game than Mike. I think Mike, despite controlling the game, controlled it in a way that didn't truly benefit him, while the Omer boot for Marianne is single-handedly the best move of the season. And also having Mike play the idol on Marianne to where Marianne can have this big reveal at Final Tribal is also something that seem to be extremely effective as well. I also feel like self-awareness is a major pro for Marianne here, where, again, for me personally, I don't really factor in awareness of your game too much when I'm assessing who I would vote for, but I know many people do. And Marianne was much more aware of the game that she played than Mike was. And I think that's obviously something that greatly factored into Marianne getting all the votes at the end there, as she really just plays into exactly what the jury wants to hear. That makes her completely outplay Mike at Final Tribal. She obviously outplays Mike at the Omer round. And I think Mike sabotaged his own game multiple points throughout the season, to where, to me, Marianne was a more consistent presence that really picked up steam towards the end. And despite still having issues here and there for a game, for me, I do have to land Marianne here at number one. But there we go. I mean, that is my player ranking for Survivor 42, which I think this one will hold. I mean, looking back at my 41 player ranking, I do not agree with that list at all anymore, considering I feel like so much information came out after season that radically changes a lot of that list, while 42 here feels more solid in terms of the fact that I feel like I have more information coming into this ranking. So that is the conclusion to my coverage for Survivor 42. I'll obviously be back for Survivor 43 at the end of the year. We'll obviously eventually talk about Big Brother 24 and the Challenge USA and Survivor SA. We also have BBAU and the Challenge All-Stars running. Also, I plan on doing some pretty big ranking videos in the off season here, where I already have some Survivor rankings planned, things like ranking every cast in the history of the show, ranking all the pre-merges, all the post-merges. I have some new what-ifs in the works, some other more general rankings. Like, channel should get back to having a decent amount of Survivor videos moving forward, because there's been a bit of a lull recently, mainly because there's been so many other shows going on. Then also, I've been hesitant to make certain videos, considering I would need to wait for the results of 42 to properly make those videos. So now that 42 is done, again, hopefully we'll have a decent amount of bigger Survivor videos coming in the next few months. Also, I know I have some Big Brother rankings planned as well. I really just have a lot of videos planned, so stay tuned for those. But for now, that is the video. Thank you for watching.